Duncan is in serious condition in a Dallas hospital. He is the first case of Ebola to be diagnosed on U.S. soil, where as many now as 100 people are being checked for exposure to Ebola. And so far, more than 3,330 people have died in the Ebola outbreak in 4 West African countries. And more than a week after the Liberian man fell ill with Ebola, and 4 days after he was placed in isolation at a hospital in Dallas, the apartment where he was staying with 4 other people had not been cleaned, and the sheets and dirty towels that he used while being sick remained in the home. How'd you like to live next to that apartment? And an American freelance cameraman working for NBC News in Liberia has now tested positive for the Ebola virus and will be flown back to the United States for treatment. As we have talked with since the beginning of this outbreak, Gary Ridenauer, expert and also the author of Pandemic. Gary, I got to ask you first and foremost, is this a real scare or is it blown out of proportion?
I think this is a real scare, and I think it's being understated by the CDC, which I now call the Center for Disaster Creation. Dr. Nancy Snyderman and 3 others are still in Africa waiting to be picked up to be brought back to the United States for 21 days of isolation. So we've got 5 evacuated the U.S., 1 snuck in, and then we have 4 more Americans on the way to the U.S. to be watched, while Louise, the partner of Thomas Duncan, the man who has Ebola, is being forced to stay in her apartment with her 13-year-old son and 2 nephews. The sad thing is the CDC sent a company called the Cleaning Guys from Dallas, Texas, to go in and clean the apartment. These are untrained personnel.
And it's probably a little late, isn't it?
Yeah, this is 1814. Lock up a black family and watch them.
And what about the plane that he was on? I mean, shouldn't that plane be disinfected?
Oh, it should be tracked down and cleaned from one end to the other. That's all there is to it.
Well, Gary, we were talking last week at how this could multiply like rabbits. And do you see that? I mean, here we are. We've got one case here. We've got people panicking. We might have 100 people that may have been exposed to it. Doesn't mean they've got Ebola. But my concern is that under every nook and cranny, are people going to say, "Oh my God, this person's got Ebola"? Somebody sneezes and they run away.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of hysteria. And talking to my patients, my God, 40% of them don't even know that there's something going on with Ebola or there's a problem in Africa. And they're just, but they don't know.
Well,
and it's awful. It's just.
It's something else. I'll tell you what, Gary, I'm going to be talking with Craig Hewlett in a moment about this and some other issues and get his take on this too. Thanks. Craig, I can't think of a better time to have you on the program. 2 things have happened that I want to get your reaction on over the past week. The Liberian newspaper claims that we created this Ebola virus, and then just a day or so ago, Louis Farrakhan, and you got to listen to what he says with a grain of salt, but he says we created this too. I want to get your take on this.
Well, I was confronted by a caller during another talk show, and he suggested that he had proof that the United States government patented the victim's blood of Ebola fever, and that we control that as a resource. I went ahead and I looked into it. I had him email me the evidence that he had, and all he actually had was a patent number for the CDC applying for a patent for the vaccine on Ebola fever, and only 1 strain of Ebola fever, and that was one of the strains that the CDC was working on. There's actually a lot of vaccines having been being worked on, but the Liberian paper, it was written by a professor at a university of psychiatry with very, very weak credentials, and it was kind of a rant. I wouldn't call it an article he wrote for the Liberian newspaper, and it was taken seriously by a lot of conspiracy theorists that this is a man-made disease. I have, and I spent way too much time. Okay, I did, George. I had to. I spent a lot of time, wasted a lot of time to prove that these things are not true. Of course, it's not a man-made disease.
And if they were true, Craig, you'd be one of the first to tell us. I know you.
There's no question. There would be nothing in the world that would stop me. I would get on a plane and fly to your home and sit on your front porch. Look, I take all of these kinds of things very seriously. We don't need to have magic and mysticism, and we don't need to be burning people at the stake for giving birth to lizards either.
That's right.
But, the problem is with Ebola is I published it. It's in a paper if you want it. You can contact my office. It's one of the lead articles. Der Spiegel interviewed the discoverer, Peter Piot, I believe it's pronounced, Piot. He's from Belgium. He's the one that discovered Ebola. And the whole process of his discovery of it it would make for a hell of a movie in itself.
Oh, my God, yeah.
It was absolutely amazing. They had none of the skill sets. They had none of the protection equipment that they've got today. He actually dropped one of the vials, and it broke on his boot. They thought they were dealing with hemorrhagic fever. It's
similar.
2 years later, they discovered this is a whole new thing. They only really discovered it and gave it its name, Ebola, when they got new microscopes, ion microscopes, that allowed them to see further into the parasite itself. And once they discovered it, that's the beginning of the process. And yes, there are people out there patenting it, but the worst thing I've discovered in all the research trying to refute the nonsense is this is a man-made disease to destroy either the black population or to depopulate areas of the planet. Nothing like that's going on. It's bad enough that it really does exist in and of itself. But the worst thing I discovered is when reporters did go out and start interviewing pharmaceuticals, and they asked them, do you have a vaccine for Ebola fever? They said yes. And they said, okay, are we going to be using it in Africa? And they said, well, nobody has shown any interest in it from a business standpoint.
That's bizarre.
What they're saying is what Archer Daniels Midland said about when Dwayne Andreas was interviewed on 2020. You're admitting you produce enough food to feed the world. Dwayne Andreas, of course we do. Then why are there people starving in Africa? He said, they have no money.
To buy the food.
To buy the food.
That's right.
And that's what the pharmaceuticals meant when they said there has been no business interest in producing the vaccine for Ebola fever on any scale, so therefore we have not done so.
Well, and here's where the conspiratorial mind takes over, Craig, because all of a sudden, let's assume these Ebola outbreaks really start to fester, and we have 1, then 10, then 20, then 40, then 2 million, and then all of a sudden, out pops the vaccine, and they're making $200 a shot.
Exactly. But that's the way the Western, and don't get me wrong, when I say capitalism, I don't mean capitalism the way the progressive left uses the language. The capitalism I'm talking about is the old term that Lenin first coined in his biography. He referred to it as monopoly financial capitalism. He didn't designate any group or people, country or place responsible. He was talking about the economic evolution of a thing called capitalism. Now, free market capitalism, something Craig Hewlett practices every day of his life since before he was in the Army and illegally while I was in the Army. Free market capitalism would solve a lot of these problems. But we're talking about predatory monopoly capitalism. And that is exactly what I've just described. They want to own that patent. They want to own the vaccine.
There you
and
go.
Only introduce it when it's a crisis because they can maximize profit as a monopoly, issuing that vaccine through a government agency like the World Health Organization and the CDC. That is hideous.
Yep. They don't want to give it to this poor sap in Dallas because, they may cure the guy, and then
exactly.
it goes away.
They're not about to do it until the bottom line proves to be viable.
Do you think they've all taken the vaccine themselves?
Well, when we say they, that you'd be describing don't necessarily live in America. They have homes in Vienna and Istanbul. They have Dhaka in the Black Sea. They're the gold-collar workers of the world. The monopoly corporate people I'm talking about have no allegiance to any country, nation, state, or people. It's about money, their shareholders, and their partners, the other corporations that they're working their monopoly goals out with. So this practice is pretty common in every area. It's just hideous that they would apply the same principles of monopoly capitalism or predatory capitalism, like from the airline industry, the defense contractors, or making automobiles and light bulbs, that they would apply it to a vaccine on a disease that could kill 3, 5, 10 million people.
Amazing. And what's so bizarre, and we're going to talk about ISIS after the break, Craig, but it seems like that story has kind of been swept under the carpet while we're running around panicking about this Ebola story.
And I think that makes the pharmaceutical corporate boardrooms smile.
They're waiting. They're just waiting.
Yep.
Probably adding up how much they could make if 1 million people got this and everything else. And what they want, I think, is for people to line up by the millions to get the vaccine.
Or maybe be told by their government that they must line up.
That they must have it.
Take the vaccine.
That's a good point.
And, of course, we won't know what the side effects of the vaccine is because it's never been introduced in large quantities into the population.
There's been talk that the CDC is botching this in a big way. What do you think?
Well, we said the same thing about the intelligence community, the New York Fire Department's response to 9/11. The truth is, and this isn't my words either, it's the researchers that discovered the Ebola fever. He said in the interview with Der Spiegel, this one disease, this peculiar disease that we call Ebola, he said it is what we describe in other areas of concern as a perfect storm. So
I believe that.
We need to take it serious. There's nothing like it. They've never dealt with anything like it before on a large scale. They should have been prepared a long time ago, preparing for dealing with it, because they had to know just on a natural progression, on a simple algorithm, it's going to happen sooner or later. But the pharmaceuticals said, yeah, well, when it looks like it's going to happen, call us and we'll see about making that vaccine in large quantities. But then, of course, during a crisis, they could charge anything they want.
Would you panic if you were just talking, standing next to someone who had Ebola?
No, right. Unless the one thing he did point out is for it to actually leap into the perfect storm, it could go airborne.
If it goes airborne, then we have a problem. If it goes airborne,
we have a real problem. Right now, it is only transmittable through saliva, blood, vomit, diarrhea. That you have to be in pretty close proximity to it. But he did say, nobody saw hemorrhagic fever going airborne either.
That's a good point. This sounds like end times, doesn't it?
I hate that, don't you? Because, that whole birth pang things, but maybe I'm getting old, but it's starting to feel like
it does. Craig, stay with us. We're going to come back and talk more about this and ISIS